Chapter 3 Leader of Kaposia, Speaker for the Dakota. I was only a brave then. I am a chief now. Teoyate Duta, about 1846. The chief is a man of some 45 years of age, and of very determined and ambitious nature, but withal exceedingly gentle and dignified in his deportment. His face is full of intelligence when he is in conversation, and his whole bearing is that of a gentleman. Frank Mayer, 1851. Teoyate Duta's chance to lead did not come as he might have expected it. During harvest time at Kaposia, his father had begun riding in a wasichu cart when it hit a bump. Joaquin Yantanka's gun went off by accident and wounded him. Kaposia's leader knew he wouldn't last long. He called two of his sons to him and gave the oldest his instructions. Teoyate Duta had been gone too long. Joaquin Yantanka was passing over him, choosing another son to be leader. No one knows how quickly the news traveled up the Minnesota River to Lac Parle. Perhaps Teoyate Duta was away on the fall hunt when word arrived of his father's death and of the new leader. He waited for the spring thaw before he and his family and a group of close friends launched canoes into the river. He was returning to Kaposia to challenge his brother. Teoyate Duta's two oldest brothers were ready when he arrived. They stood with the whole village on the banks of the Mississippi as Teoyate Duta's canoe floated near Kaposia. "You are not wanted here," one brother called out. "Go and live at Lac Parle." Standing tall and unarmed, arms crossed over his chest, Teoyate Duta called back, "Shoot then, where all can see. I am not afraid, and they all know it." His brothers were brave, but Teoyate Duta's challenge unnerved them. One managed to shoot, just missing Teoyate Duta's chest. The lead shot passed through his overlapping forearms, shattering the bones. While his brothers fled deep into the woods, his supporters from Lac Parle laid Teoyate Duta down in the canoe and paddled quickly to the fort. Wasichu medicine had kept the people of Kaposia safe from smallpox. Perhaps the Wasichu doctor could make Teoyate Duta's arms whole again. A leader needed his hands and arms. So did a hunter and a warrior. Inside the doctor's office, a fire blazed, casting light on the saw used to take off arms and legs. Looking at Teoyate Duta's wounds, the doctor explained that it was a hopeless case. Both arms had to be sawn off. Otherwise, infection would spread. But Teoyate Duta refused. He asked his supporters to take him back to Kaposia, to the Dakota healer there. It was a risky plan. Teoyate Duta's brothers might well be planning to return and attack. His family and supporters from Lac Parle might not be safe at Kaposia. He too would need protection. For weeks, Teoyate Duta waited for the Dakota healer's herbal medicines and prayers to work. The people of Kaposia waited too. They wondered about this man who spent so much time away from home. Finally, Teoyate Duta began to recover. Although his wrist bones were shattered and he was never able to move some of his fingers, his recovery seemed like a miracle. The people of Kaposia saw it as a sign of Teoyate Duta's bravery and fitness to lead. They threw their support behind Joaquin Yantanka's oldest son. Now Teoyate Duta would listen to the people of Kaposia when they met in council. Now he would speak for them when the Wasichu asked for treaties. And now he would ask them and his supporters from Lac Parle to hunt down his two oldest brothers and kill them. Their bones, he said, should be thrown into the river. As far as Teoyate Duta was concerned, they had no place on the cluster of wooden platforms on the hills above Kaposia. They did not deserve a proper Dakota burial. Teoyate Duta allowed his remaining brothers to live. They were the children of his father's third wife, and too young to be a threat to his power. In the summer of 1846, Teoyate Duta settled into life at Kaposia. It was a different life from the one he had known as a boy. The changes bore heavily on his mind, when he cradled his newborn son, Wamanape, appearing one, in his arms. Babies in Kaposia were so used to eating the annuity flower that they asked for bread and spit out the corn their mothers grew. The hills and streams on the eastern side of the Mississippi, the ones Teoyate Duta had explored as a boy, were filled with Wasichu settlers. Their town of St. Paul was growing. More people than he remembered bustled around the fort. Everywhere, the Wasichu were crowding in. How could one raise a Dakota boy in such a place? For Teoyate Duta, survival depended on taking the best from the Wasichu while leaving the rest behind. So in November 1846, he asked a missionary to open a school in Kaposia. Teoyate Duta thought his people needed the letters and numbers he'd learned at Laki Parle. While Teoyate Duta couldn't stomach Christianity himself, he saw no harm in it for others. Even some of his wives had converted. Dr. Thomas Williamson and his sister Jane were pleased when the young leader asked them to come to his village. But they couldn't have been happy when Teoyate Duta continued to sell whiskey to other Dakota along the Minnesota River. To Teoyate Duta, it made perfect sense. The government annuities did not give the Dakota enough food and money to survive. Game near Kaposia was scarcer than ever, what with white settlers hunting too. Farming, although it suited some of his relatives from Laki Parle, like Lorenzo Lawrence and Paul Mazzacumani, was not for Teoyate Duta. Like most Dakota, he saw farming as women's work, whether the corn was planted in small mounds of dirt or plowed in big fields. Teoyate Duta's work as a trader brought in some much-needed income. From time to time, his travels also gave him the chance to show his bravery and skill as a warrior. In 1848, he came upon a group of Ojibwe on Dakota lands. It was a hunting party, and Teoyate Duta led the attack and took away the hunters' pelts in the process. While Teoyate Duta traveled from St. Paul's saloons to scattered Dakota villages, he heard about changes to the east. On the other side of the St. Croix River, on land Teoyate Duta had known as a child, the Wasichus were forming a state. They called the place Wisconsin. It was to be a part of the United States. 1 year later, in 1849, whites living west of the St. Croix, in tiny settlements and towns like St. Paul, formed a territory they called Minnesota. They used the Dakota word Minnesota, meaning whitish water. But Teoyate Duta could see that they meant to make a Wasichu country of it, a place like their United States. Word soon reached Teoyate Duta that the new territorial governor, Alexander Ramsey, was interested in negotiating a treaty. Ramsey wanted still more Dakota land. Teoyate Duta wasn't surprised. Of all the Mdewakanton leaders, he lived closest to the Wasichu and their towns. The treaty his father had signed in 1837 gave the whites the right to settle on a slender strip of land between the St. Croix and Mississippi rivers. But smoke from cabin fires now smudged the skies well west of the Mississippi, and more Wasichu kept coming. In the summer of 1851, Governor Ramsey let it be known that he and other whites were ready to negotiate. Much about the negotiations made Teoyate Duta uneasy. Governor Ramsey was negotiating first with the Sissetons and the Wahpetons to the west of Kaposia. Teoyate Duta heard from his friends at Laki Parle that times for these Dakota were very hard. Deer and muskrat and buffalo seemed impossible to find, and many of the people were starving. When people were hungry, they might agree to almost any deal. And if the Sissetons and the Wahpetons sold their lands to the Great Father, the Mdewakantons and the Wepekuts would be hemmed in on both sides, east and west, by white settlers. Teoyate Duta made a point of traveling to Traverse des Sioux, near present-day St. Peter on the Minnesota River, to watch negotiations with the Sissetons and the Wahpetons. His old acquaintance and trader, Henry Sibley, was part of the Wasichu group. Surrounded by familiar faces, Teoyateduta relaxed enough to allow a Wasichu artist named Frank Mayer to draw his portrait. But when the Wasichu and the Dakota gathered under the arbor, made of a freshly cut tree branches, he strained every muscle to hear and to remember the words that were spoken. Governor Ramsey rose first and talked of the Great Father or President in Washington and his wishes. "He has learned," said Ramsey, "that you have broad lands up here, notwithstanding that you and your children sometimes starve in the summer and freeze in the winter. He has been informed that there is little or no game on these lands, and that for you, all your purposes as Indians, they are of little benefit to you, while he has many white children who would improve them." Ramsey and a Washington official spoke of settling the Dakota on a strip of land along the Minnesota River. The official explained the president's wishes. "Your great father intends to place farmers among you when you are settled there to teach you and help you to cultivate the soil. He expects, likewise, that in a few years you will all have comfortable houses to live in, that your children will be taught to read and write as those of the white people are, that you will not only have corn aplenty, raised by yourself, but cattle, horses, and other animals, that you will have both provisions and clothing sufficient to keep you from starving or freezing." For the land, the Great Father would pay the Sissetons and the Wampatons $1.6 million. Certainly, all these promises sounded good, at least to those Dakota who were willing to farm. But once negotiations ended, one older Dakota, big curly head, stood and spoke his mind. "You think it a great deal of money to give for this land," he said, "but you must well understand that the money will all go back to the whites again, and the country will also remain theirs." Surely, Teoyateduta and other Dakota would have agreed that one way or another, the Wasichu always managed to get the best of any treaty or deal. In spite of such feelings, the Sissetons and the Wapatons signed the treaty. Later that month, treaty negotiations with the Midewakanton and the Wapakuts began in Mendota, a small trading settlement on the Midewakanton land above the mouth of the Minnesota River. Ramsey's offer to them was similar to that made to the western Dakota. In return for their wooded homelands around the Mississippi and lower Minnesota rivers, Ramsey promised money and a comfortable home for you and your children in all time to come, between the Yellow Medicine and the Redwood rivers. The eastern Dakota would have a reservation on prairie lands just east of the Sissetons and the Wapiton Reservation. On the first day of negotiation, Wabasha was a spokesman for the Dakota, but no decisions were made. As another leader noted, "Our habits are different from those of the whites. When we have anything to consider, it takes us a long time." Over the next few days, one decision was made. Teoyateduta would speak for the Dakota. Perhaps he had convinced the others that he understood the Wasichu well, that he was unafraid of their numbers, and he would only agree to a fair price. Or that he was brave enough to remind the Wasichu of promises left unfilled from the treaty his father had signed in 1837. On July 31st, he rose. "Fathers," he said, "these chiefs and soldiers and others who sit here have something they wish to say to you, and I am going to speak it. There are chiefs here who are older than myself, and I would rather they had spoken it, but they have put it upon me. And if I feel as if my mouth was tied, these chiefs speak of some money that is due to them. It was mentioned the other day to Governor Ramsey, and we spoke about it last fall, but we have not yet seen the money. We desire to have the money laid down to us. It is money due on the old treaty, and I think it should be paid. And we do not want to talk on the subject of a new treaty until it is all paid." Ramsey tried to change the subject, but Teoyateduta wouldn't budge. "We will talk of nothing else but the money, If it is until next spring, he answered. The Dakota had another complaint. The reservation land set aside for them was too much prairie. Teoyateduta explained that the Mdewakanton people were people of the woods. The Sissetons and the Wapetons might like living on tall grass prairie, but how could the Mdewakanton live in such a place? Any reservation had to include some wooded land. Ramsey and the government officials made vague promises about the money owed under the old treaty, and they agreed to extend the reservation a bit farther. Not as far as Teoyateduta had asked, but far enough. On August 5th, 1851, the Eastern Dakota were ready to sign the agreement. The man they chose to sign first could write his own name in his own language. Teoyateduta.